Okay, so when last we met, we were looking at the conversation between Telemachus and Athena.
I believe so.
Part way into Book 1. Immediately preceding this, Athena is at the Council of the Gods on Olympus, where she's able to sue for, that is to say, plead with the royal authority for Odysseus to intervene in his behalf, because Poseidon is away. In similar fashion, because Odysseus is away, the suitors can do what they're doing. Athena, having proposed to Zeus the idea that Telemachus should do these two things, call an assembly and take control over his mother's marriage, she then goes down to Ithaca and does precisely those things. Urges Telemachus to do those.
Can I ask why?
Of course.
Why does she do that? What reason does she have? Is it because they're both like minds of many turns or whatever? We talk about them like sort of drawing parallels between the two. So that just she feels like camaraderie.
They're both polytropos. She does have a certain kinship of spirit to Odysseus, which is based largely on their metis, their cleverness, their being polytropos, of many turns, sinuous thoughts,
so
polomechane.
So she kind of enjoys reveling in a like-minded person, I guess.
Yeah, and Poseidon is still opposing Odysseus' return, and he is of the older generation of the gods, contemporaneous with Zeus and Hades. He is Athena's uncle, and she can't really act directly in opposition to him, but she can certainly act with that indirection which constitutes metis, cleverness, plotting.
As the gods do, right? I feel like they never act directly, I do though.
Interestingly, they do in the Iliad. In the Odyssey, they don't, because the gods are at one more remove from human beings as compared with their position vis-a-vis human beings in the Iliad. In Book 5 of the Iliad, Athena comes to Diomedes in the thick of the fighting and says, "I have taken away the mist from your eyes, son of Tydeus, that before now was there, that you may well know the god from the mortal. If any of the immortal gods approach you in the battle, do not fight with them, for the wrath of a god is hard to deal with. Only golden Aphrodite, for she is a goddess without warcraft, her you may stab," which he proceeds to do and wounds her in the hand. You can see Athena directly participating in the battle before Troy, that is in front of Troy, on the plains of Troy in the Iliad. Ares participates in the battle. Apollo participates in the battle. In the very first book of the Iliad, Apollo shoots from afar arrows of plague at the Greek camp, and first the dogs died, and then the mules, and then the men. So they intervene very directly. Okay. Here it's less direct, so that Hermes goes and speaks to Calypso, and then goes away.
So when Hermes or when Athena comes and intervenes indirectly, or indeed more directly, in the affairs of mortal human beings, including Telemachus, Odysseus, Diomedes in the Iliad, and so on, is that a human event which the Greeks merely imagine as taking place outside the mind and the social sphere in the God's activity, or is it instead the visitation of an actual conscious and personal divine being? Well, can it be both?
These are complementary constructs, like the wave-particle duality in optics. On the one hand, the muse is the goddess. On the other hand, the muse is the unconscious. Part of what's to be gained from bringing to somebody else's sacred text, the Iliad of the Greeks, the Vedas of the Hindus, the same level of interpretive investment and hermeneutic interpretive ambition that you normally bring to the sacred text with which you were raised. When you do this, provided that the sacred text to which you are a new pilgrim is adequate to that kind of devotion, it yields its secrets to you gradually as you bring to bear that kind of earnest interpretation, and you begin to discover, oh, the sacred text with which I was raised is not unique in its wisdom, capacity to induce trance, tangential to the holy quality. There's a book by a man named Walter Otto called The Homeric Gods, which treats them as essentially real.
That's cool.
And the category which will contain both the god of the Hebrews, who is jealous and insists, thou shalt have no other gods before me, a position called monolatry, the worship of only one god, which evolves into monotheism, which means the belief that there exists only one god.
Right.
But if you take the claim that there is only one god and bracket it within the religious tradition that asserts it, namely Judaism, Islam does the same thing, Christianity being a bit looser because their God is three. It says in the Quran, don't say three, God is one. Especially if you're a Catholic, where the Holy Spirit is an active element in religiosity. The category that can contain any gods that anybody might want to acknowledge, including the one God, is the category of the divine. Because it's a transcendental term which you can populate with whatever personification you want of that which transcends the world order of time, space, and causality. There is, as you may know, a branch of religious thought, and at least according to the 18th century taxonomy, a branch of philosophy, called theodicy. This word was invented by Leibniz in the 18th century, a person who, independently of Newton, but at the same time, developed the calculus. Leibniz had an extraordinary string of amazing scientific and intellectual achievements, and one of them was he wrote this book called Theodicy, a word he coined, from two elements of Greek, theos, God, and dike, delta, iota, kappa, eta, justice.
That's cool.
The court is the dikasterion.
Theodicy means
the justice of God. The way theodicy works is as follows. There are three propositions to which we find ourselves theologically committed. That God is omnipotent, all-powerful. That God is omnibenevolent, all good. Benevolent means bene, good, and volent, willing. That he is entirely good in willing his will. That his will is good, that he wills the good. And wills only the good and not the evil.
Right.
And the third proposition is that evil is real. And the remarkable characteristic of this set of three propositions, God is all-powerful, God is all good, evil is real, is that if you take away any one of the three, the other two will work just fine and correspond to appearances, experience. If God is not omnipotent, but is all good willing, evil is real because he lacks the power to enforce his entirely good will.
That's what I was thinking.
Yes, and if he is not omnibenevolent but is omnipotent, evil is real because he permits evil. He's not all good. And if evil is not real, then we can have a God who's omnipotent and omnibenevolent, but that leaves us in a difficult position of experiencing evil and being obligated to deny its reality.
Sure, exactly.
However, that is Leibniz's solution, saying in this same book, this is the best of all possible worlds. A position called optimism, that everything is optimal. A position held to be absurd by the satirist Voltaire, who mocked it in a novel called Candide, in which a ridiculous figure, Professor Pangloss, is forever quoting Leibniz without attributing it to Leibniz, saying, this is the best of all possible worlds. And what Leibniz meant by that was, the presence of evil in the world is paradoxically a factor in the world's goodness, because we are improved by our suffering, which is like the suffering of Jesus on the cross. Wisdom is found in pain. Our empathy develops from feeling our own pain and extrapolating from it by analogy to the pain of others, which we then attempt to reduce by mercy. And just as the blacks in a painting throw the shapes of the colors into relief, that is, cause them to be more pronounced and forthcoming and vivid, so the evil in this life makes meaningful the good. This argument crumbles to powder when you contemplate much less endure an experience that is absolutely ravishing, devastating.
Sure.
The loss of a child being the worst, but there are plenty of others. Horrific injustice. Very difficult to shrink that down to the size that it will fit in the frame of that argument.
Right.
On the other hand, there is a thing that my sister calls post-traumatic bliss, which is the peace that comes to people who have suffered to the point where their old self falls away like the shed skin of a snake. And they emerge with a kind of Buddhist calm in which they accept everything that is and accept at the center of that acceptance evanescence, impermanence, the fact that everything perishes and falls away.
Well, I think we all know that. Hopefully one day I'll come to terms with that one day.
That's the developmental task that we're all working on.
Yeah.
So, in Book 1, at the council, the political meeting, the meeting that is intended to produce consensus and policy, Zeus raises the question of Theodicee in an ancient and polytheistic form. Men complain that suffering comes from us, the gods, and yet, by their own recklessness, they bring on themselves pains beyond their lot. In that case, yes, evil is real, but it comes from human folly.
Right.
Now, the whole problem of Theodicee does not arise in a polytheistic world, so what I've just described is a monotheist reading of Zeus's speech. The reason, as you can see, no doubt, why Theodicee does not arise in a polytheistic world is that there you have the wonderful freedom to say, the reason why God has not permitted Odysseus to return home, but is instead tormenting him for 10 years of wandering, is because Athena, the god, wants him to get home, but Poseidon, the god, wants him not to go home. In the Euthyphro, a dialogue of Plato about religion and piety, Socrates frustrates Euthyphro by shaking his confidence in Euthyphro's own expertise in matters of religion, an expertise which Euthyphro claims in a grandiose way, that he understands everything about the relationships between the gods and human beings. And Socrates indicates that piety is more complicated than Euthyphro has realized by saying, what is piety, Euthyphro? And the young Euthyphro answers, it is doing what the gods want. And Socrates says, well, if you were to do as you say you want to do and arrest your father for murder because he had a slave on his estate who killed somebody, and to punish that murderous slave, Euthyphro's father bound him hand and foot and threw him in a ditch overnight, and the man died of exposure. Now Euthyphro wishes to take on the impiety of bringing pain to his father by prosecuting him for murder. And that's why Euthyphro is standing online outside the Dikasterion, the court. And the reason Socrates is standing online to see the magistrate outside the Dikasterion is because Socrates has been brought up on charges of corrupting the young.
Oh, yeah.
And they get to talking. And so, and indeed another charge on which Socrates has been brought up, that is arrested, is that he believes in different gods from the gods of the city. That he has made a mistake in religious piety. So the matter is of some pressing urgency to Socrates. What is religious piety? And he asks Euthyphro for help in irony. It's Socratic irony for the wise Socrates to say, oh, please, young Euthyphro, you must help me. You have all the great expertise anybody could want in matters of religion. So, what is justice, Euthyphro? Socrates, justice is simply doing what the gods want. Yes, but if you go ahead and prosecute your father, presumably that might please Zeus, who castrated his father, Kronos, but it would not please Kronos,
Right.
whose son attacked him, castrated him. Different gods want different things. Well, as long as that's the case, we don't need Theodicee because none of the gods is omnipotent. Indeed, none of them is omnibenevolent either. But unearned suffering certainly does exist. I will simply tell you before we move on that the bombshell in the Euthyphro, a brief, short Platonic dialogue, is another response that Socrates gives to this grandiose false expertise of Euthyphro as regarding what is piety, what is the holy. Not just in terms of what is worthy of worship, but also what constitutes holy action. What is holiness in human conduct? In other words, what is piety? And that response is this: Euthyphro, is the holy holy because the gods love it? Or do the gods love it because it is holy? And the reason why this question causes an earthquake in Western thought is that neither answer is satisfactory.
And each answer causes a crisis.
Because if the holy is holy simply because the gods love it, then the gods just might find holy and therefore command us to do awful things which are repugnant to our sense of ethics. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob speaks to Abraham and says, "Oh, you know that only son of yours, whose birth was so miraculously unlikely that your 90-year-old wife, on learning from the angel Gabriel that she was pregnant, laughed aloud at the absurdity of the notion? That beloved son who rescued you both from barrenness, childlessness, against all odds? Well, you now personally must murder him. Lead him up Mount Horeb and bind up Isaac with the rope. Make the bundle of sticks and ignite it and roast your son alive till he's dead. Or slaughter him slaughter him ritualistically and then burn his body as a sacrifice to God." And Abraham says, "Hineni, here I am. Okay, I'm yours to command." And he's praised in the tradition for his willingness to do that. The humanist reading of that story, a story called the Akedah, which is in, I think, Genesis 21, the humanist response would be to defy God and say, that is a morally repugnant command. Any God who requires me to kill my own son is not worthy of worship. Destroy me. Right. Do as you will. I cannot become that. And that would be rewarded by a God whom we would regard as worthy of worship. The point of the Akedah is instead to say, whatever your humanistic ethics, regardless of your sense of justice, of what good and evil is, of what is an appropriate action for a human being, the sovereignty of the divine utterly trumps it all. Exactly, it trumps it. And in the book of Job, where God's behavior is just completely unjust, that point is made even more forcefully. The opening lines of the book of Job are, "There was a man in the land of Uz, and his name was Job, and that man was without sin and upright." So he's done everything he's supposed to do to ward off disaster in a universe governed by reward and punishment, administered by a God who governs by reward and punishment according to the contract theology in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, which says, here are my 613 commandments, do them all, and you will be multiplied to a great nation, and your crops will grow, there'll be plenty of rain. Don't do them, and I will destroy you guys. It's a contract. He tells you what he needs from you. In Job obeys all those commands, and God crushes him to powder, inflicting on him the worst of sufferings. And the comforters who come to help Job make it worse by saying, "Oh, God is just. God is the way he's depicted in the books of the law, Leviticus and Deuteronomy. He's a God of contracts. He tells us what we must do. It must be that you've sinned. You must have made some mistake in the 613 commandments, for which God is now punishing you because he rules the world through reward and punishment." And Job says, I was there. I know I didn't do anything wrong. And even if I did, look at the scale of what God is inflicting on me. I, Job, insist that it is not punishment, it is abuse. And God speaks from the whirlwind and says to the comforters, "Why have you not spoken truly of me, as my servant Job hath?" In other words, I am a wild being prior to civilization. I am not the captive of that branch of philosophy which deals with the good, namely ethics, I am most directly grasped through the branch of philosophy which deals with the real and the unreal, metaphysics. Because the world is real due to God's action. He says to Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" In other words, you didn't exist. I made the earth exist, and then I made you exist. So being and non-being, which utterly transcend good and evil, because without being you cannot have either good or evil, trump ethics. It is as if Job, in raising the ethical question of God's justice, were lighting a candle and asking God to answer the question of this candle by focusing an answer on the flame and blowing it out. And what God does is, he doesn't blow it out. The sun of God's unfathomable wisdom, the blazing thermonuclear furnace, that star close to the earth, rises, and just as a candle flame in the daytime, it continues to burn but is reduced to insignificance by the blazing light of the sun and heat of the sun. So this ethical question, why do I suffer even though I was pious, is not answered, but is reduced to insignificance by God coming out and saying, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? Canst thou fish out Leviathan with an hook?" And of course, then we had the whaling industry, which did exactly that. And then the next line is, "Wilt thou play with him as with a bird?" At SeaWorld, it's jump through the hoop, Shamu. And on, the things listed in the book of Job as exemplary of human impotence, as compared with God's omnipotence, have since then become part of the human repertoire, which is remarkable.
But so if these gods are beyond like being and not being, I guess, which makes them beyond ethic. But at the same time, they seem so like I personified them. But
they aren't beyond being and non-being because they don't make the world. The Greek gods are simply part of the world, and there is no creator god in Greek mythology. Yeah, and the world is regarded as eternal, so that there is no problem as to how it got here. Zeus rules the world, but we do not owe him our very existence.
So, to complete the thought about Euthyphro and the question that Socrates asks him, is the holy holy because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it is holy? Each answer is unsatisfactory and imposes a crisis. If the holy is holy merely because the gods love it, then the gods might love anything, no matter how repugnant to our ethical impulses. But if the gods love it because it is holy, it is already holy without the gods loving it, which means that we do not need the gods in order to discover the good. It is inherently good all by itself. Why then do we need the gods? They become simply the first on line in the long line of beings gazing at the good and striving to perform it, for they are merely stronger than we and have been here longer. Return now to the point about complementary constructs. The goddess is the unconscious is the goddess.
These complementary constructs, as the wave model of light is a complement to the particle model of light, they don't fit together, but neither of them is a complete account of the reality of experiment, on its own. The wave model of light accounts for the interference pattern in the double slit experiment, but doesn't account for the photoelectric effect. The particle model of light accounts for the photoelectric effect, but does not account for or fit with the interference pattern at the back end of the double slit experiment. They are mutually exclusive, and yet reality, experiment, demands both of them. So as for creativity, poetic inspiration, which is itself the subject of another Platonic dialogue called the Ion, which is about the experience of hearing Homer's poetry, the complementary constructs where creativity is on the one hand something that has its source in the unconscious, and on the other hand something which has its source in the visitation of a feminine divine principle, or of Apollo, It is the left brain that holds creativity to come from the unconscious mind. It is the right brain that knows with an intuitive certainty, obviously, if I created a poem or a painting or a sculpture, it's because the muse came. Didn't feel like it came from me. In the poem, we are told that the men ate and died. Odysseus suffered and came home. He suffered, they ate. And there are parallel constructions in the rhetoric, the way the words are arranged and what words are used. So Homer is inviting you to make that comparison.
Between the suitors and Telemachus and... Would you say like Telemachus and Odysseus and the suitors and his men?
Yes. That Odysseus is to his men as Telemachus is to the suitors. Now, not exactly, because Odysseus is on the same team as his men,
right.
But the parallelism is that the large group of relatively average men indulged, was impulsive, imprudent, did not make the necessary sacrifices and endure the pain of delaying gratification, and they consequently perished. So did the suitors. Odysseus suffered and survived. Telemachus suffers and survived. So there's that parallel. And here we find Telemachus in pain, waiting for his father, and he despairs. He says, I don't know whether I'm the son of Odysseus or not. Nobody knows whose son he is. That despair, which is on page 8, line 215, is healed by Athena's production of the image of Odysseus in Telemachus' mind's eye. Athena, in the guise of Mentis of Taphos, paints forth in words, which is what the poet Homer is doing in making the poem, the image of Odysseus. Notice that on its face, the part of Athena's action which has human social significance, whereas flying away like a bird has no social significance.
No one seems to mind.
The part of it that has human social significance, namely serving as a developmental pivot, a pivotal moment through which Telemachus has an accelerated episode of maturation, that part can indeed have been done without any magic or supernature, by having a conversation with a mentor, which is where we get the form mentor, an older person who has some wisdom of life and provides you with a way of thinking and feeling which transcends what you have known hitherto, provides you with some wisdom. When that happens, when a youth is blessed by a conversation with an older person that actually meshes with the gears of his current state and proves developmentally useful in a non-linear way, which seems to transcend the little fragment of time that it took to have the conversation, a god is involved. A person hits puberty and is physically transformed, a god is involved, the goddess Hebe. A person gives birth and a new human being is there suddenly, a god is involved, Elethwea. A person falls in love, he has been shot by the arrow of Eros, or touched by Aphrodite. People get married, Hera is involved. A person dies of an aneurysm. If it's a man, he was shot by Apollo. If it's a woman, she was shot by Artemis. Things that have social significance which changes what's happening in the human world or its meaning can be attributed to the divine because of this non-linear quality, something which makes a quantum difference, which is to say an irreducible step. And the Greeks even have a special word for that kind of moment. Regular time, which is measured by the clock and is ubiquitous, is called chronos. So, chronos is regular chronological ticking clock time of an endless series of identical intervals, populated by whatever the hell is going on, no matter what it is, significant or not. Kairos, Kairos, is the time of significance, the right time, the auspicious moment. The kairotic moment is the thing people seek when they consult an astrologer. Tell me, what is the right time to plant my crops, impregnate my wife? What's the correct time for her to give birth? The optimal time. What's the optimal moment for us to break ground for this new palace? The events which are worth recording in the poem, and including in its visual field, are the kairotic moments. The ones that don't get included are non-kairotic. Presumably, this whole story is to be imagined as having lots of trees in it. Now, we've shifted from time to things, but it's a pretty clear analogy. Only a few trees have a role to play in human discourse, social life, and so on, have a human significance, like the tree that is one of the bedposts of the marriage bed of Odysseus and Penelope, or the thicket of wild olive and domestic olive in which Odysseus sleeps when he emerges exhausted from the sea in Scheria among the Phaeacians. Those plants are included in the poem, even though they're plants, because they play a significant role in human affairs. But they are not the only trees growing in the Homeric world. They're just the only ones we can see. So kairos is a moment which gets included in the narrative frame because something happens in it which is significant to us, rather than to the ants. Sometimes the Greek world speaks of fate, a category whose nature, living or non-living, personified or impersonal, is never clearly specified, except that we know that it transcends the power of Zeus. Sometimes, on the other hand, we hear of the will of Zeus being worked out. Deos de teleatobule. Of Zeus was being worked out the will. Deos de teleatobule. And that tele is the telos, the end point, the working out, the outcome that Zeus has willed is being worked toward. In Christianity, the word kairos gets absorbed from Greek theological discourse to refer to the birth of the Messiah and the crucifixion. That's the moment of maximal human significance. So much so that it divides all of history between BC and AD. There's before Christ and there's the year of our Lord, Anno Domini. That's as kairotic as you can get. Line 320 on page 10.
There we go.
She flew upward like a bird. Into his spirit she had put strength and courage. She put him in mind of his father more than before. And that divine assistance of putting the image of Odysseus in Telemachus' mind more than it was before, the image not of a lost man.
Giving it shape.
Yes.
At least, like, maybe not like a shape, but something to hold on to, something more with life wrapped.
Oh, a shape indeed. Yes, giving it shape, because when he's on Calypso's island, the island of She Who Conceals, he is as shapeless as, you cannot see. You can believe that when a man and a woman are having sexual intercourse, the man's sexual organ still exists, but you can't see it. It has no visible shape. It is concealed. So is Odysseus, a masculine principle, in the feminine island of Ogygia, where Calypso dwells. A tree-lined island, which is rather like pubic hair, in the navel of the sea.
Fantastic.
So back to Book 1, line 320 and following. Having spoken so, bright-eyed Athena went off. She flew upward like a bird. Into his spirit she had put strength and courage. She put him in mind of his father more than before. When he thought it over, he was amazed in his spirit. He thought she was a god. And at once, watch this, the godlike mortal went toward the suitors. The epithet Dios, which literally means of Zeus, but more generally of God, is used of Telemachus immediately following his having been visited by a god. Now, when a god appears to a human being, as Athena indirectly does, indirectly because she's disguised at first as a particular human being, and indirectly after that because she does something impossible only a god can do, but he does not see her with her helmet on, holding the divine shield, the aegis, undisguised, but it is disclosed to him that she must be divine because she turns into a bird and flies away. Anytime a god appears directly or indirectly, it is called a theophany. Theos, God, and the fan part from which we get the form phantasm and phenomenon means an appearance. So a divine appearance, an appearance of a god, is a theophany. This happens with Moses when he sees God on the mountaintop of Sinai, ponim aponim. In Yiddish it's punim, but it means face to face. Hermes appears to Odysseus and so on. And at once the godlike mortal went toward the suitors. A renowned singer was singing to them. They were sitting in silence listening. He sang of the baleful return of the Achaeans from Troy that Pallas Athena laid on them. Now that's the theme of the wrath of Athena. Athena did not persecute Odysseus, but Athena persecuted many of the other Greek kings and generals on their way back from Troy. And this is a trace of a lost poetic cycle, a lost epic text about the return, the homecomings of the Achaeans, the Greeks, from the war at Troy, in which the chief divine antagonist is Athena. The chief divine antagonist in the Odyssey is Poseidon, antagonizing Odysseus, and a divine antagonist is a principle of deferral, deferring the end of the poem, causing the telos, or endpoint, outcome, not to come too soon. Because if it comes too soon, the poem's over and everybody has to go home. The daughter of Icarius, prudent Penelope, from her upper chamber hearkened to the divine song. She descended the lofty stairway from her dwelling. Not alone, but 2 servants followed along with her. And when the godly woman had come to the suitors, she stood by the pillar of the stoutly fashioned roof, holding the glistening headbands before her cheeks. A devoted servant maid stood near her on either side. Then, weeping, she addressed the godlike singer. Phemios, you know many other ravishments for mortals, the deeds of men and of gods that singers glorify. Sing one of these as you sit among men, and let the men drink wine in silence. But stop singing this baleful song, which forever wears away my own heart in my breast, since an unforgettable grief affects me heavily. I long for a person so dear, remembering always that man whose glory is wide through Greece and middle Argos. She wants the story of the return of Odysseus, which is here treated as part of a wider song about the return of various heroes from Troy. The return of Odysseus is a painful story, and she wants that story to stop so that she won't have to suffer. Odysseus' name means man of pain, from a verb odunai, to will pain toward or to suffer pain. Odysseus is the man of pain, the man of suffering. Penelope is suffering and wishes to refuse it. She has this desire to forget Odysseus and move on with her life, but she cannot forget him and hasn't forgotten him at all. Telemachus defends not ease and comfort, for which the suitors stand, and which Helen will stand for when she drops a drug into the wine in Book 4 at precisely the same kind of moment when Menelaus is telling a story about Odysseus after the war at Troy, and Telemachus starts crying. And Helen drops into the wine a drug so potent that if you saw your own family killed in front of you, you wouldn't shed a tear. That's in favor of spacing out, getting high, avoiding suffering, and thereby postponing the growth which comes from suffering. The suitors do that. Odysseus' men do that. They perish. Odysseus feels the suffering, and he grows in the developmental reading of the Odyssey, and in the non-developmental reading, he at least advances toward the telos, or end point. Telemachus is now growing, and on behalf of growth, rather than impulse and sensual pleasure-seeking and immediate gratification, he says, no. Mother, for what reason do you begrudge the trusty singer's giving pleasure with whatever his thought rouses in him? Singers are not guilty. Now, of course, these words are in the mouth of Homer himself, who was a singer, and of generation after generation of bards and then rhapsodes, all of whom are singing the same poem. So it's like writing, say, a rock and roll song about rock and roll, which happens all the time. Ziggy Stardust is about a rock star. Singers are not guilty. I suppose Zeus is guilty, who gives to bread-earning men to each one as he wishes. It is no wrong for this man to sing about the evil fate of the Danaans, which is the Greeks, the Achaeans. Different words for the same people. Men acclaim that song the most, which has come round newest of all those who hear it. The top 40 station plays the newest music. It doesn't care what was in the top 40 3.5 years ago. And apparently that is not new, because in the ancient world this was the case as well.
Okay.
Let your mind and spirit resign you to listening. Suffer, because then you'll grow. Odysseus is not alone to have lost his day of return, his nostos, in Troy. Many other mortals perished there also. Well, come into the house and apply yourself to work, to the loom and the distaff, where women's work is done, which is making clothing, and give orders to your servants to set at the work. This talk will concern all the men, but me especially, for the power in the house is mine. She was amazed at him. His behavior toward his mother, as the masculine power in the house, and in a patriarchal culture like this one, the dominant power, is the direct result of Athena's inspiring him with the image of adult manhood exemplified in his father Odysseus. Telemachus pivots on that, immediately begins to behave like a masculine adult, a man. Penelope is amazed, and although she's here been kind of scolded and pushed around, what every mother wants is for her son to grow into the normative male of the culture. And here that's finally happened. And you might have thought, Penelope might have thought, that it would never happen because he hasn't seen his father since he was a baby. And it's the image of the father, as we've seen in this part of this story, which transforms boys to men. There's much more female power, diverse kinds of it, in the Odyssey than there is in the Iliad, although in both poems, women, like men, are traded as chattel. Sarah Pomeroy wrote a book called Goddesses, Whores, Wives, and Slaves about major categories or roles of women in the ancient world. And clearly, whores and slaves are low categories, and wives and goddesses are high ones, like the Madonna-whore split that we talk about in modern psychology. In that book, it's made clear, and in many other books, such as the distaff side, a distaff is a thing mentioned just now here, a tool of women's work, where you spin with a distaff the wool of a sheep into a yarn, and with the loom you weave that yarn into cloth. It's articulated in those books that Greek women shouldn't be thought of as helpless and without any personal agency, merely because they lack the prerogatives and opportunities of their brothers and sons and fathers. They are subordinate, there's no question. However, in no culture is the subordination of women tantamount to their total erasure from social power. Women have myriad ways of asserting themselves beneath and behind the screen of male authority, and often wind up running things in a covert way. Penelope is like Odysseus. Polymetis, Polytropos, Polymechane, having many machinations, from which we get the form machine, because it is a device which someone has devised through cleverness, through metis. Many other mortals perish there also. Then he instructs her. She was amazed at him, line 360, page 11. Back into the house she went. The sound-minded speech of her son she took to heart. She entered the upper chamber with her serving women, and then wept for Odysseus, her dear husband, until bright-eyed Athena cast sweet sleep upon her eyelids. The suitors were making a din, a great noise, through the shadowy halls. They all gave voice to the prayer of lying in her bed. They all wanted to sleep with her. Sound-minded Telemachus began speaking to them. Suitors of my mother, he will now carry out the instructions of Athena. With your excessive insolence, let us now take our pleasure and dine, and let there be no noise, since it is lovely to listen to a singer of the kind this one is, who resembles the gods in his voice. And at dawn tomorrow, let us all go and take our seats in council, an assembly. No assembly has been held on Ithaca since the departure of the king, Odysseus. Notice that there is an asymmetry between a political model in which aristocrats get together in an assembly to deliberate what to do, as the gods have on Olympus, and a monarchical model in which a king dictates what to do, as Zeus can do and sometimes does. This suggests, indeed, that monarchy during the time of the composition of the Homeric poems was on its way out and was being valorized, lionized, praised nostalgically by a conservative who lived during an aristocratic period when the monarchies were gone, the palaces had been destroyed, and the nobles who own the broken fragments of those once grand estates gathered together in council to decide what to do. And that's why the aristocrats, these suitors, are portrayed as no good, because the poet is a monarchist who is nostalgically praising the vanished institutions of kingship.
Telemachus continues, and at dawn tomorrow let us all go and take
our seats in council so that I may tell you something outright. Get out of the halls and partake of other dinners, eating your own goods, visiting each other's homes, and if it seems better and preferable to you to consume one man's livelihood scot-free, waste on, but I shall call on the eternal gods for help. Now he says this knowing that the gods are already interested in him and involved in the working out of events, so that Zeus may grant there to be acts of retribution, and then scot-free within this house you may die. Scot-free is ironic there. So he said, and they all set their teeth on their lips and wondered at Telemachus that he spoke so courageously. Antinous, the ringleader, says the footnote, and most insolent of Penelope's suitors, the son of Eupeithes, addressed him first. Now, many of the points that I've articulated in our work together come from this remarkably good and stimulating book, The Unity of the Odyssey by George Dimmock. Another point that he makes is that the names of Odysseus and Telemachus are man of pain and far fighter, fighter from afar. Tele, like television, vision from a distance. Telescope, sight from a distance. Machros, fighting. Telemachus, the far fighter, which means he fights over a wide range. The man of pain, Odysseus, the far fighter, Telemachus. The names of the two major suitors, their antagonists, are Antinous, the opposed mind, the mind that is against, the thought that opposes, Anti-noos, and Eurymachus, Eurymachos, wide fighter. So what the suitors are trying to do is to replace Odysseus and Telemachus with themselves. People teach courses in the Bible as literature, and it's making an opposite move to teach a course that you might dare to call literature as religion. Now we hear from a suitor. Antinous, the son of Eupeithes, addressed him first. Well, Telemachus, the gods themselves must be teaching you to be presumptuous and speak courageously. Well, in fact, we know that's true. May the son of Kronos, that's Zeus, over sea-circled Ithaca not make you king. Your paternal right by birth. That's one of the rudest things he could possibly say. Sound-minded Telemachus addressed him in answer. Antinous, even if you are offended at what I say, still I would wish this very thing done if Zeus were to give it. Would you call this the worst thing to happen among men? It would not be bad at all to be king. There comes at once an opulent home for the man, and he is himself more honored. Yes, there are also other kings of the Achaeans, many in sea-circled Ithaca, young ones and old ones. And one of them shall have this, the kingship of the place, since godly Odysseus is dead. But as for me, I shall be lord over our household, and over the servants whom godly Odysseus won for me. Now, remember, Telemachus was in despair before Athena came, saying that or after Athena came, but before she spoke to him about Odysseus. And he said, I don't know whether I'm Odysseus' son or not. And Odysseus is lost in obscurity, his bones tumbling in the waves, shapeless and invisible. Now, he's heard from Athena that Odysseus is alive and will be coming back. He'll hear it from several people. So we don't really know the level of Telemachus' inward, secret confidence or doubt about the possibility of the eventual return of his father. Eurymachus, son of Polybos, addressed him in answer. Now that was Antinous speaking before, now it's Eurymachus. Those two are the main suitors. Eurymachos, Telemachos. Wide fighter, far fighter. Telemachus. All this lies in the laps of the gods, who of the Achaeans shall rule in sea-circled Ithaca. May you have your own possessions and be lord in your own home. May a man never come while Ithaca is inhabited who would tear your possessions away from you by force. In other words, we're not trying to dispossess you. We're simply eating slowly all the herds of swine, cattle, and sheep that your father owned and that you stand to inherit. And we're not doing it by force. Oh no. Now the point of this assembly is to lay bare the naked facts of the situation which the suitors would prefer to conceal, even though it's an open secret. Athena comes and tells him, look, make it unmistakably obvious to everybody that the suitors are there against your will. A wonderful thing that Dimmock says in wording that is worth quoting directly is this. It's on page 23 of the Unity of the Odyssey, in the chapter 1, the Image of Odysseus. The beauty of the suitor's position lies precisely in the fact that, as long as nothing is known about Odysseus, they can woo his wife as though he were dead, while ignoring Telemachus' rights as though Odysseus were alive. The beauty of the suitor's position lies precisely in the fact that as long as nothing is known about Odysseus, they can woo his wife as though he were dead, while ignoring Telemachus' rights as though Odysseus were alive. They can equivocate between those two positions, availing themselves of the advantages of each, even though they mutually contradict one another, and both cannot be true. Right. This is having their cake and eating it too. The cosmos is not set up to permit that, so they get killed. Eurymachus says, may a man never come who would take your possessions by force. But I want to ask you, my brave man, about this stranger. Now they notice, now that their asses are on the line, they're being threatened, even though they don't take the threat seriously. They are at least anxious enough to ask, hey, wait a minute. A guy came in here, spoke to Telemachus, and now he sounds really mature. And Antinous joked, hey, surely the gods are instructing you. Right. Uh-oh. Where did the man come from? And what country did he claim to be from? Where are his birthplace and his father's land? Does he bring some message that your father is coming home? Oh, do they have a vested interest in knowing that? Or did he come here seeking some personal need of his own? He started up so and went at once. Now they saw that, but not the fact that she turned into a bird. That he, the apparent human being, was in fact Athena who then turned into a bird. They don't see it because they are not pious enough to be capable of noticing that. Nor did he wait for us to find him out. Yet his face did not look like a coward's. Then sound-minded Telemachus addressed him in answer, Eurymachus, surely my father's return has been lost. I put no trust in a message, wherever it comes from. And I give no heed to any divination my mother might ask of a diviner, calling him to the hall. The stranger is a guest friend, a xenos, from which we get the form xenophobia, a guest friend of my father's from Taphos. He declares he is Mentes, son of skillful Anchialos, and he rules over the Taphians who are fond of rowing. So Telemachus said, but in his mind knew the immortal God. And that means he is now behaving like Odysseus, knowing one thing and saying another, which contradicts it. The men turned then to dancing and delightful song. Agamemnon was incapable of doing that. He tries it once in the Iliad and it's a disaster. The men turned then to dancing and delightful song and took their pleasure and waited for evening to come. That's typical of the suitors. As they took their pleasure, black evening came upon them. They went away, each to his own home to sleep. But Telemachus, where his bedroom was, built aloft in a very lovely courtyard in a place with a view all around, went to bed pondering many things in his mind. They took their ease and pleasure and slept. He was up all night pondering serious affairs. Eurycleia, which means wide fame. Eur is wide, and kleos is fame. The chief value in the Iliad is masculine reputation for prowess in war, which is called kleos and is translated glory or fame. And before this point in Book 1, Telemachus has already said, I wish he had died in the war at Troy, then the Achaeans would have made a burial monument for him and he would have had kleos, fame, glory, a perpetually surviving image, non-living, but an image, a kind of immortality of reputation. Odysseus is offered an immortality of experience by Calypso. You can live forever on this island, but you will have no reputation because you'll be invisible. Nobody can see you. Eurycleia went in with him and carried the flaming torches. The devoted daughter of Ops, Paisenor's son. Laertes bought her once as one of his possessions. When she was still in her first youth, he gave 20 cattle for her, and honored her the same as the devoted wife in the halls. But he had never lain with her, for he feared his wife's wrath. Interesting. The suitors are not the only ones who will be killed by Odysseus and his tiny handful of allies at the end of the poem. They will also kill several of the servant girls who decided to be the concubines of the suitors. Yeah. Whereas here Laertes restrains his own sexual impulse and is prudent out of respect for his wife. But he had never lain with her, for he feared his wife's wrath. Going with him, she carried the flaming torches. She loved him, that is Eurycleia, the old woman, loved Telemachus, the young man, most of all the servants, and had tended him as a child. She opened up the doors of the stoutly fashioned bedroom. Now, you could say that that line is a foreshadowing of the opening up of the doors at the end of the poem when the suitors are taken, or indeed the closing of the doors at the end of the poem when the suitors are locked in so they can't escape. He sat down on the bed and took off his soft tunic and put it in the hands of the shrewd-minded old woman. She folded up the tunic, put it in smooth order, and hung it on a peg beside the jointed bed. How beautifully vivid! Here, deep in the ancient world, there's this technique which will look novelistic later on. The realism of, say, Zola, or somebody who is at pains to include just such concrete physical phenomena as she hung the tunic on a peg. It's taking part in the kairos of the visitation of Athena, the theophany of Athena to Telemachus. Because what he's doing on this night is mulling over everything that Athena told him. Then she went out of the bedroom, drew the door shut with a ring.
Now, the sliding of the bolt into whatever the bolt slides into resembles, as was pointed out by a student of mine, the flight of Odysseus' arrow at the climax of the poem through the heads of the axes that are lined up as the target for the almost impossible feat of archery, which determines who will be the successful suitor of Penelope. It turns out to be Odysseus himself. In addition to this, the drawing of the bolt full length by its thong may resemble the pulling of the bow, where the thong corresponds to the bowstring.
There all night long, wrapped up in the sheepskin, he pondered in his mind the course that Athena had shown.